Data released by the African Partnership to End Violence Against Children has revealed that more than half of the children experience physical abuse. Meanwhile, in some parts of the continent, 4 in 10 girls suffer sexual violence before the age 15. To talk to me more about the new drive to tackle high levels of violence against children is Dr. Joan Nyanyuki, the Executive Director of the African Child Policy Forum. Dr. Nyanyuki, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight here on In Focus. 30 years after the Africa Children's Charter was adopted, African governments still failing to protect children from violence. How bad is the situation?
Good evening and thank you for having me. And to get straight to the point, the situation is bad. The situation is bad, especially in the last 18 months, but consistently from 2014 when we published our last data in our last report, which showed that governments are failing in their obligations to protect children from violence. And they're failing in several ways. The first and most profound is that they do not have the necessary laws and policies to protect children. And then second, they do not set up the necessary services, programs to deliver the necessary protection that children deserve. And lastly, which has been a consistent and very worrying trend in most countries across the continent, is that the budget allocations for protecting children, for child rights, for ensuring that children are safe from violence is still very low. So in those 3 areas, we are still very concerned. So we are seeing the numbers going up. We are seeing staggering figures in most countries across the continent.
Is there political will to end violence against children in Africa? And what do you look at, I mean, when you look at whether or not there is that level of political commitment?
I think you've actually just hit the nail on the head in terms of what our event was this afternoon. When we launched our 3 reports, the main objective was actually to catalyze the political will that is needed to translate government commitments into actions that benefit children. And what we are saying that it's one thing for countries to ratify international instruments, to ratify and adopt the Convention on the Rights of Children, the African Children's Charter. It's another thing for them to actually give life to the provisions of these international instruments. That is where the gap is. And that is what really takes political will. It takes political will to say that children are not number 10 in terms of priorities in a country, are not number 10 in a region, whether it's SADC or East Africa Community or ECOWAS, but they are number 1. And therefore resources will go into children first, and then later into infrastructure, telecommunications, military, and everything else.
The economic and social impact, something a little bit more complex and I suppose more difficult to immediately address, but equally harmful to the safety and the dignity of children.
Yes, and it's one thing that data has shown us is that the effects of violence are lifelong. When you think of a child is only a child for that short time. That time is never going to be recovered. So first we think of not just the safety, the physical safety, but even the psychological impact. And studies have shown what it means when children survive violence, especially in their early formative years, below 5, what that translates to into their adult years. So the element of safety should not just be physical, but also psychological and emotional. And that's why we are flagging that a lot of the violence that happens, whether it is sexual exploitation, corporal punishment, other forms of physical abuse, they're happening in the home, in families, in a family setup, in the places where children should feel most secure. And so we are saying that the emotional and physical safety has to be safeguarded right from the home. But at the other level, we have to also look at the larger social and economic impact of violence, what it means in terms of cost to children when they cannot attend school and they do not perform well in school because of the psychological effects of violence. What does that translate to in terms of their future life potential? What does it translate to in terms of economic burden for the country, when these children become adults? So this is not contestable, really, that there is a huge economic cost that Africa is going to carry if we do not stop violence against children now.
The rate of corporal punishment in South Africa, very high at 56%. Tell us what the report found.
We looked at all forms of violence, and we did not specifically look at one form of violence in a particular country. There are elements which, however, we found to be quite consistent. And if I may talk about corporal punishment, that together with sexual violence have been found to be some of the most alarming forms of violence that occur facing both boys and girls. And in terms of corporal punishment, the difficulty with corporal punishment in terms of data and reporting, in terms of data, is that there's a lot of underreporting. And if I can just connect this to our African culture, and the sense that, raising a child is almost synonymous with imparting forms of punishment, but unfortunately it is physical punishment. And then we look at the history of a lot of our countries where there has been a lot of violence, either as armed conflict or other forms of violence. And so violence has been normalized. That's the first problem culturally. The second one is that we do not see children as being human beings who possess their full dignity and full human rights. Because if I may ask you, it is a criminal offense to physically assault an adult, but it is not a criminal offense in many of our countries to physically assault our children. Why is that? And so we are calling upon countries to actually put into practice the principles of the best interest of a child. There are other forms of discipline. There are other forms of parenting. There are other ways of raising children without imparting violence and initiating a cycle of violence which then spirals throughout a child's life. And just to say that corporal punishment is also one of the forms of violence that actually is quite prevalent across the world. So this is not only Africa lagging behind, but for us, I think the difficulty is that the conversation on corporal punishment is not happening.
Now, the conversation is about a new drive to tackle violence against children in Africa. What are the proposed new strategies and interventions that will be engaged with in this new renewed focus?
Yes, so we are, as the African Child Policy Forum, we are talking about a few basic principles. We are talking about, first, we want to see a real demonstration in action of the political commitment. We want to see governments that have ratified instruments actually bringing them to life, and that is upon the political leaders that we have. The second element is being able to develop programs and plan accordingly to the laws. There is right now a very big disconnect between what the laws say on one hand and the practice. And so we need to see that bridge being bridged. And there's only three things that need to be done for that to be bridged. One, there has to be the budgets and the resources. That's most fundamental. The second one is that there has to be the systems, and these systems need to be coordinated across the different sectors, because violence against children is not only for the children's department. It concerns security forces. It concerns traditional setups and communities. It concerns the education system. It concerns security agencies, the judicial system. So we need to see that law policy to practice linkage, not only having the budgets, but also having the necessary infrastructure and the system. And the last thing we're talking about is really being able to see evidence and data that informs the practices, because that is lacking, and hence the value of the three reports that the African Child Policy Forum issued today.
The Executive Director at Africa Child Policy Forum, Dr. Joan Nyanyuki, appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus.